In the shadow of law and order, lies can fester, hidden beneath the very fabric of the community. A sheriff, highly respected, feared by some, admired by many, was entrusted with the safety of his town. But within the walls of his quiet home, behind the polished badge, a secret affair unfolded. A 19-year-old girl, disabled and vulnerable, found herself ensnared in a relationship that began in secrecy and spiraled into darkness. This wasn't just any affair. This was a relationship tainted by power and manipulation, a relationship that would soon lead to an unthinkable tragedy. In a town where everyone knows each other, the sheriff is more than just an authority figure. He's a fixture of daily life, a person who embodies security and leadership. The community sees him as a man of integrity, one who has served for years, shaking hands at local fairs, attending town meetings, and maintaining the order everyone depends on. His home sits on the edge of town, overlooking the streets he patrols, the streets that he believes are his responsibility. But beyond that stoic face, behind the sheriff's badge, there was a secret, one that no one saw coming. The young woman at the center of this story is 19, but her life is far from typical. She is marginalized, existing on the periphery of this small-town life. Her disability isolates her further, making her interactions limited to a few trusted individuals. Her world is small, constrained by her condition and her circumstances. Some knew her or thought they did, but to many she was invisible, a life barely noticed, until it was too late. The sheriff's presence in her life began innocently, at least on the surface. He had known her family, often lending a helping hand to those in need, further solidifying his role as a protector. But slowly their interactions became more personal, more intimate. What started as a concerned figure taking an interest in a vulnerable young woman soon turned into something else, something hidden. The sheriff, a man with much to lose, and the girl, isolated and marginalized, became involved in a relationship that had to remain secret. But how could this happen? How does a respected man of authority get involved in an affair with a young, disabled woman? And why did she go along with it? These are the questions the town would ask themselves later as the dark truth began to surface. But at the time, no one knew. No one suspected the quiet interactions that took place behind closed doors. How did no one see it? How did a small-town sheriff, a figure of respect and power, enter into such a dangerous relationship with someone so vulnerable? Was it love? Or was it control? Was this a relationship of mutual consent? Or was it something far more twisted? As we unravel the events, it becomes clear that the sheriff was far from the upright figure he portrayed. The town trusted him, yet, in the shadows, he maintained a double life. His relationship with the girl wasn't just a matter of secrecy, it was built on an imbalance of power. The girl, isolated by her disability and already marginalized, found herself swept into a relationship with a man who held all the cards. Did she see this as a way out of her isolated world, or was she simply manipulated into a situation from which she couldn't escape? The affair grew deeper and darker. The girl, now pregnant, faced a future that neither she nor the sheriff had anticipated. A future that couldn't remain hidden. The pregnancy was the first tangible sign of their secret, a complication that would soon spiral out of control. For the sheriff, it was a ticking time bomb. If the truth came out, he would lose everything, his career, his family, his standing in the town. But for the girl, it was even more complicated. She was carrying his child, and with that, she carried the weight of a secret that could destroy both of their lives. But how did it all begin? Did the girl willingly enter into the affair, or was she manipulated by the sheriff's position of authority? These are questions we may never fully know the answer to. What we do know is that the girl's isolation made her an easy target. Her disability kept her out of the public eye, and in the sheriff she may have seen a figure of protection, not realizing until it was too late the consequences of their relationship. The town, however, remained unaware of the brewing storm. On the surface, everything seemed normal, just another quiet day in a quiet town. But underneath, the affair was heading toward an inevitable explosion, one that would leave the community shaken to its core. How did a relationship built on secrecy, lies and manipulation end in murder? Could it have been avoided, or was this tragedy inevitable from the start? As the pregnancy advanced, so did the pressure. The sheriff's once well-ordered life began to fray at the edges. He could feel the walls closing in, and with each passing day, the reality of what he had done threatened to come crashing down. The girl, now pregnant, was becoming a liability, and the sheriff was desperate to keep the affair under wraps. But how far would he go to protect his secret? This was no longer just an affair. This was a threat to his entire life, and the sheriff was willing to do whatever it took to keep it buried. The pregnancy was the breaking point. The sheriff, now desperate, took matters into his own hands. In a decision that would forever alter the course of both their lives, the sheriff made a choice that would end in bloodshed and ruin. What exactly happened in those final moments? How did the sheriff go from protector to killer? These are the questions that the town would later grapple with, questions that have haunted the community ever since. As the story delves deeper, unsettling details emerge, each one peeling back another layer of deception and control. The sheriff's power in the town was more than just symbolic, it was pervasive. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him. But the deeper he became involved with the girl, the more his life, once orderly and respected, started to fray at the edges. In public, the sheriff continued to uphold his role as the town's protector. His reputation remained impeccable, his influence over the town's affairs undiminished. His presence at town meetings, fundraisers, and community events was a constant. But behind that facade, the sheriff's world was spiraling into chaos. He wasn't just hiding an affair anymore. He was hiding the consequences of that affair, a pregnancy that threatened to ruin everything. The girl, meanwhile, became more isolated than ever. Her world, already small due to her disability, shrank even further as the pregnancy progressed. No longer able to hide the growing life inside her, she was forced into a position of silence and fear. The sheriff's control over her tightened. He knew that her isolation and vulnerability gave him the upper hand. She had no one to turn to, no way out of the situation. The imbalance of power was palpable. He had the resources to cover up the affair, but her pregnancy was a complication neither of them could fully control. The town remained blissfully unaware, seeing only the surface of their sheriff's life. No one could imagine the truth lurking beneath the sheriff's uniform. No one suspected that the man they entrusted with their safety was now driven by fear and desperation, trying to manage the fallout of his secret relationship. The situation reaches a point of no return. The sheriff is no longer just trying to hide an affair, he's trying to save his entire life from crumbling. But the girl, carrying his child, is a constant reminder of his indiscretions. Every day that passes brings him closer to the moment when his secret will be revealed to the world. The morning of the discovery began like any other in the small town. A cool breeze swept through the streets. The residents went about their day, unaware that something had just torn through the fabric of their quiet lives. The girl, missing for days now, had been found, but it wasn't in any way anyone could have imagined or prepared for. Her body was discovered in a remote field on the outskirts of town, a place so quiet and far removed that it seemed unfathomable that such a horror could have occurred there. The discovery was grim. She had not just been killed, she had been brutalized in a way that shocked even the most hardened of the town's investigators. The body, battered and bruised, showed signs of a violent struggle, and the realization that this young girl, who had been so vulnerable in life, had met such a terrifying end, weighed heavily on everyone who laid eyes on the scene. For many, it was the first time they had come face to face with such raw violence, and the image of her broken form would linger in their minds long after the investigation concluded. He small town, so familiar and ordinary, now looks foreign, as if the discovery of the body had fundamentally altered the landscape. The focus shifts to the body itself, covered by a sheet, but not enough to obscure the evidence of the brutality she endured. Blood stains the dirt beneath her, and nearby, a broken necklace glimmers faintly in the light. The gruesome details begin to filter out to the town. Whispers spread through the streets, from the church to the local diner, from house to house. The brutality of the murder, the horror of what had been done to the girl, left everyone reeling. How could such violence happen here, in a place where nothing like this had ever occurred before? The town, already on edge from the girl's disappearance, was now gripped by a new pervasive fear, and soon that fear turned to suspicion. The sheriff, who had been at the forefront of the search for the girl, now stood at the center of an investigation that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. He had been so confident, so adamant about finding her killer, but as the investigation deepened, the investigators began to realize that the answers they were seeking might lead them back to him. As investigators began to piece together the events leading up to the murder, the picture became increasingly disturbing. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime, it was the growing evidence that pointed to someone close to the investigation itself. At first, no one wanted to believe that the sheriff, the man who had protected them for years, could be involved. But the evidence was mounting, and it was impossible to ignore. The affair between the sheriff and the girl was no longer just a rumor. It was a fact, corroborated by text messages, witness testimonies, and phone records that placed them together in the days leading up to her disappearance. The sheriff's carefully constructed life was beginning to crack, and with every new piece of evidence, the investigators grew more certain that the answer to the girl's murder lay with him. The sheriff's behavior grew more erratic as the investigation progressed. He became defensive, snapping at colleagues who asked too many questions, avoiding the public as much as possible. At home, his family began to feel the strain of the growing suspicion around him. His wife, once so confident in his innocence, started to doubt the man she had known for so many years. The town, too, began to change in its perception of the sheriff. Conversations that had once been filled with admiration now turned to hushed whispers of doubt. Could the sheriff have committed such a heinous act to cover up the affair and the pregnancy? Was he so desperate to protect his secret that he would go to these horrifying lengths? And if the sheriff, the man they trusted, could do something like this, what else might he be hiding? The growing suspicion was impossible to ignore. Investigators began to look at the sheriff's movements on the night of the girl's disappearance. Surveillance footage showed his car near the remote area where the girl's body was found. Witnesses came forward, saying they had seen him acting strangely in the days before the girl was killed. All of this was circumstantial, but taken together, it painted a damning picture. The sheriff's denials became weaker with each passing day. He insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder, that the affair had ended long before the girl's disappearance. But the evidence told a different story. DNA found at the crime scene matched the sheriff's, and the timeline of his alibi began to fall apart under scrutiny. The town, once united in their support of him, was now divided. Some still believed in his innocence, while others began to see him for what he really was, a man capable of murder. As the investigation deepened, the community's reaction shifted from disbelief to anger. How could they have trusted someone who had been capable of such betrayal? The sheriff, once seen as a protector, now seemed like a predator. Town meetings were no longer quiet discussions of local issues. They became battlegrounds where the sheriff's name was at the center of heated debates. People who had once defended him now turned their backs. The girl's family, devastated by her death, began to speak out, demanding justice, demanding answers that only the sheriff could provide. Meanwhile, the sheriff's home life begins to unravel. His wife, who had stood by him through the early days of the investigation, now begins to distance herself. The strain of the accusations, the whispers that surround them wherever they go, becomes too much to bear. Their children, once proud of their father's position, now feel the weight of the town's judgment. They are no longer just the sheriff's family. They are the family of a suspect, a man who might have committed the ultimate betrayal. The investigators had everything they needed to confront the sheriff. The DNA evidence, the surveillance footage, the witness testimonies, all pointed to one conclusion. The sheriff, once the most trusted man in town, was now the prime suspect in a murder investigation. The confrontation was inevitable. The sheriff was arrested at his home in the early hours of the morning. The scene was both quiet and chaotic. His neighbors watched from their windows as the flashing lights of police cars illuminated the street. His family, caught in the middle of the storm, stood on the porch, their faces a mix of shock and despair as the man they loved was led away in handcuffs. As news of the sheriff's arrest spread, the town found itself grappling with a truth that it had tried so hard to avoid. For weeks, people had whispered about the possibility that the sheriff was involved, but now it was real, official. His arrest wasn't just a blow to his family, it was a blow to the entire community's sense of safety. The man who had been their protector, their confidant, was now the prime suspect in a young girl's brutal murder. Investigators revealed that the sheriff's desperation to keep the affair secret had likely driven him to kill. As the details came to light, it became clear that the sheriff was grappling with a truth that it had tried so hard to avoid. For weeks, people had whispered about the possibility that the sheriff was involved, but now it was real, official. His arrest wasn't just a blow to his family, it was a blow to the entire community's sense of safety. The man who had been their protector, their confidant, was now the prime suspect in a young girl's brutal murder. As the trial approached, more disturbing details began to surface. Witnesses testified that the sheriff had been increasingly erratic in the days leading up to the murder. His once calm demeanor had been replaced by short tempers and paranoia. Investigators found more evidence, hidden phone calls, deleted messages, and even traces of the sheriff's presence at the murder scene. The timeline, once unclear, now painted a damning picture. The girl had been lured to the remote location under the guise of a final meeting. She had trusted him until the very end, not knowing that her life would be cut short. The town, once divided in their opinions of the sheriff, now began to come together, united in their need for justice. The sheriff's supporters had dwindled to a few, but even they struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster being described in court. The evidence was undeniable. His fingerprints on the murder weapon, his DNA on the girl's body, and the damning text messages that revealed his desperation to silence her before she could expose him. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as the sheriff's trial unfolded. Despite the mountain of evidence that had been presented, DNA at the scene, surveillance footage, witness testimonies, there was a feeling of unease, as though something crucial had been left unspoken. As the prosecution laid out its case, meticulously building the narrative of a sheriff who had spiraled out of control in a desperate bid to keep his affair and the pregnancy a secret, small details began to emerge that suggested a more complex story. The trial had a profound effect on the town. For years, the sheriff had been a pillar of the community, respected, trusted, and admired. His fall from grace was not just a personal tragedy, it was a collective wound that left the town reeling. In the wake of his conviction, the town found itself divided. Some residents, particularly those who had known the sheriff personally, continued to believe in his innocence. They couldn't reconcile the man they had trusted for so long with the cold-blooded killer that the prosecution had portrayed. These residents spoke of a man who had been under immense pressure, driven to make terrible decisions in a moment of panic, but who had never intended for things to go this far. But the sheriff's conviction didn't bring the closure that many had hoped for. The town remained haunted by the case, and for years afterward it was the subject of gossip, speculation, and division. The girl's family, devastated by the loss, struggled to move on, while the sheriff's family was left to deal with the shame and stigma of his conviction. The sheriff's children, once proud of their father's position, now faced bullying and ostracism at school. His wife, once the respected spouse of the town's protector, found herself alienated from the community. Just when everyone in the town had begun to settle into the new reality of life after the sheriff's conviction, believing the case had reached its conclusion, a chilling revelation surfaced, one that would throw everything they thought they knew into question once more. A new piece of evidence, buried deep within the case files, was discovered by a young intern working in the district attorney's office. The intern, tasked with sorting through old case documents, stumbled upon a folder that had somehow been overlooked during the trial. Inside was a series of notes, text messages, and surveillance footage that had never been presented in court. These documents suggested a connection between the sheriff and an unknown third party, a person whose identity had never come up during the investigation. The notes included cryptic messages exchanged between the sheriff and this individual, and the surveillance footage placed this mysterious person near the scene of the murder on the night of the girl's death. Suddenly, the once clear narrative of a desperate sheriff covering up an affair seemed far more convoluted. The new evidence sent shockwaves through the town once again. Had the sheriff been working with someone all along? Was he merely a pawn in a larger game? Or had this third party manipulated him into committing the crime? The questions multiplied, and once more the town found itself engulfed in speculation and fear. As more details from the newly discovered folder were revealed, it became clear that the sheriff hadn't acted entirely alone. The third party, identified only by an alias in the messages, seemed to have had a significant influence over the sheriff in the weeks leading up to the girl's death. Investigators began to wonder whether the sheriff had been coerced or blackmailed, forced into a situation where he saw no other way out. This revelation sent the media into a frenzy, and soon theories about the true identity of the third party spread like wildfire. Some believed it was someone powerful within the town, someone with ties to local government or law enforcement who had a vested interest in keeping certain secrets buried. Others speculated that the girl had uncovered something far more dangerous than her affair with the sheriff, something that had led to her death. But the new evidence raised more questions than it answered. Who was the third party? What role had they played in the crime? And most importantly, why had this information been buried during the trial? As investigators dug deeper into the case, they found themselves faced with a tangled web of corruption and deceit that stretched far beyond the sheriff's initial motives. The entire foundation of the case seemed to crumble, leaving the town in a state of confusion and fear once more. Despite the new evidence, the third party was never identified, and the full truth of what had happened remained elusive. Some believed that the sheriff had indeed been part of a larger plot, while others thought he had been blackmailed or coerced by forces beyond his control. And then there were those who still believed in the sheriff's guilt, convinced that the new evidence was simply a distraction from the real issue. The sheriff had killed the girl, and no amount of speculation could change that. The town once again found itself divided. Some residents demanded a retrial, convinced that the sheriff had been wrongfully convicted. Others, weary of the constant upheaval, just wanted to move on, to let the past stay buried. But the mystery of the third party remained, casting a shadow over the town that refused to fade. The girl's death, once thought to be a straightforward case of a man trying to cover up his mistakes, had turned into something much darker, much more complex. What do you think really happened? Could the sheriff have been innocent all along, or was he working with someone more powerful? Share your theories in the comments below and let us know what you think. The invitation to speculate draws viewers into the conversation, making them an active part of the mystery's resolution, or lack thereof.